People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
This is Mr. Kurka, our new boss at the office. This is our assistant manager, Miss Winter.
Sexy eyes.
Do you love me? But I haven't done anything like this before.
Don't worry, it's easier than adultery.
Oh, that's done it.
Tea. How did the tea get in those bottles? Come now. Tell me everything.
Have you been saying anything to him?
What if I did? I don't know what you feel.
Alena, I love you.
Welcome to the projection booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Miss Kat Ellinger.
Hello.
Also back in the booth is Mr. Jonathan Owen.
Hello.
We conclude Czechtember 2022 with a bit of an oddity. We're discussing the 1965 film from Jiri Weiss, 90 Degrees in the Shade. The film was a Czech and British co-production, meaning that there is both a Czech and English version of this film. It's the story of Alena, a woman who has been involved with a married man who is also her boss. That's always a bad mistake, Alena. And one that will lead to a lot of intrigue when Rudolph Hrusinky, as Mr. Kurka, audits the shop in which they work. We will be spoiling this film as we go along, so if you don't want anything ruined, please turn off the podcast after you have seen the film. We will still be here. Jonathan, what is your history with 90 Degrees in the Shade?
I discovered it about 10 years ago, I think, and it was kind of in a rather sort of dry academic way because I was researching co-productions between Czechoslovakia and the West. So I think it was at the time that I was researching Alan Rob Grier's sort of Slovak adventure. And I had believed, I think for a long time, that that was basically the first, sort of co-production between communist Czechoslovakia and the West. And then I realized I was wrong and there were actually a few other ones preceding that. And so that's how I came across this film, and it was actually amazingly on DVD at the time. I think it had been released on British DVD the year before, I think about 2011, weirdly enough, in a kind of British film series, which was sort of like an unusual way to place it, really. And I must admit that the first time I saw it, it didn't really make a huge impact on me. I think it was just because it is such an oddity in a way, and just in terms of like the location, I think it just confused me or confounded me a little bit because of the fact that, it's set in Prague, you can tell it's Prague, and yet you have these kind of two British actors. And I only saw the British version. It was only the British version that was available. So I think I was just a little bit confounded by it the first time. And then also the genre, because it seems to be a few different things at once. I couldn't quite grasp whether I was watching a thriller. Is it a kind of like a romantic drama? Is it a psychological study? Since I've watched it more and more, I think I've kind of like come to appreciate it more. I think especially things like the performances. I think Hrusinky, is giving a really, typically great performance. And having access to the Czech version as well, enabled me to appreciate that. And I think it's something that I've come to appreciate more and more. I think the more I've watched it, I've noticed more sort of subtle details in it. And I think it's been a grower really on me.
A grower, not a shower?
Exactly.
Oh, Mike.
I'm sorry, Kat. I don't mean to offend you.
I'm easily offended,
And Kat, how about yourself?
This is new to me, which is rare because I usually go for the safe options on this. You bring the lift up. But I had this on my radar for a while because I love the director's murder Czech style, which is just great. I just hadn't got around to it, really. And so that's why I picked the episode, because I thought, well, seeing as I only ever watch things for work or projects, it'll give me a good chance to catch up with it. And I think it's interesting what Jonathan said about it being confusing, because the thing that struck me is, outside of the fact that they're obviously in Prague and you've got signs in Czechoslovak language and that, it struck me, it's like a totally British new wave film. It's like more like a kitchen sink drama. Really reminded me of something like Room at the Top with Simone Signoret. And this whole idea of a doomed love affair. This guy's a bit of a chancer. He wants to make his way up in the world. And so I found it really interesting, because when you think of the British New Wave and the Czech New Wave, they couldn't be any further apart. The British New Wave was revolutionary because it became very natural, sort of working class, gritty lives and all this class stuff in black and white and about couples and stuff. And the Czech New Wave was all about breaking those boundaries, like wild editing, crazy montage, all this experimentation. So I was expecting something more on the Czech side and found a British film. Fortunately, I only got to see the British version. I know the Czech version is shorter. But yeah, it surprised me. It wasn't what I was expecting at all. It is so British in so many ways. Also, Kenny Ames, who we're going to have to talk about. I know that probably won't mean anything to you, Mike, but...
Yeah, this was a new one for me as well. And it was, I don't want to use the word surreal because people overuse it. It was very disconcerting, let's say, to see Rudolph Hrusinky, Vladimir Menzik, Jiri Slovak, all of these very familiar faces. We've talked about them so many times when we go through these Czechtember episodes. Them speaking English, it took me forever to just detach myself, especially Vladimir Menzik, just like this chatterbox thing that he's doing and this guy who's dubbing him over. And I'm like, this is so weird for me to see him speaking quote unquote English. I was just like, wow.
It's like the dub to Marcello. I saw that Come As You Are. Is it the one with Natasha Kinski? It's the only other time I've seen Marcello Mastroianni dubbed. And I couldn't deal with it. It's like, stop, this isn't right. This is wrong. Who did this?
Yeah, at least the guy who dubbed Lino Ventura in The Medusa Touch, he was doing a pretty darn good job. But yeah, this was just so strange. And I was having a hard time. Well, not a hard time. I found it very interesting, let's say, that I don't know who the protagonist of the film is, because so much of it is Anne Haywood as Alena. But then also it is Rudolph Hrusinky as Rudolph Kurka, the inspector. I like that they are giving us these two protagonists, and really, at first it feels like Kurka is the antagonist, but really he's the protagonist as well.
I have to say, before we start off, the Kenny Ames comment was down to James Booth, who plays the love interest, or the guy that Anne Haywood's having an affair with. Now, he's like all over British TV and British film, but to me, it'll always be this character called Kenny Ames from this series that was on in the 80s called Auf Wiedersehen, Pet. And if you've got BritBox, it's on there now. So I went back and watched them again last year, and they're amazing. And it's about a group of northern builders. The first series, they go off to Germany and they're trying to earn money. In the second season, they go off to Spain. And the second season, you get this character called Kenny Ames, played by Booth, who's like this. He's like this gangster. He's like this cheeky gangster. He's into orgies and playing the country lord. And he's really dodgy. And he's also a bit of a comedy character as well. And I could not stop thinking about him as Kenny Ames. And I was like, this is Kenny Ames, the origin story. He starts off this low-level stealing alcohol and letting women take the blame. And he ends up somehow as Kenny Ames, you know, Lord of the Manor, this cheeky gangster. And I just could not get beyond that. I just could not get beyond. It's good, but I kept thinking, you know, this is Kenny Ames, the origin story. It's a total precursor.
I kind of have a similar reaction too, I think, to the way he's used in it, because I think, you know, like that word cheeky kind of is the word that I kind of apply to him, really. I think in the kind of persona that he has, if you think of him in Zulu or something like that, I mean, he's that. And there's that film that he made with Barbara Windsor in the early 60s, which I think is called Sparrows Can't Sing, which is this kind of, that's very much in that vein of that kind of like early British kind of kitchen sink, kind of like this Cockney, you know, sort of slice of life. And I mean, he's really in that vein there. And I feel here, he's kind of, I mean, I guess in his other roles, he's often a kind of like a disreputable figure. But I think here, he's kind of quite a nasty character. And I feel that it's somehow sort of like restraining that kind of like cheeky, sort of like ebullient persona a little bit. And I feel that, yeah, you don't get the full sort of James Booth kind of experience maybe in this. I think it's kind of like a little bit.
He's definitely proto Kenny, because Kenny is funny, but also Kenny is a nasty piece of work. And you always get that in that show. And I saw that as a kid. It was like huge. And so he always became Kenny Ames to me. And the fact that character that he plays here has some of those same qualities, like, you know, he just turned on you. It's all that nice, cheeky stuff is really the claw behind the glove. And I think that's what made it so British, because that whole cheek thing is like a very British thing, isn't it? The cheeky criminal type, which is what he is. I mean, God, he's terrible, really. It was really surprising, really disconcerting to see Kenny Ames in a Czech film.
This is the second time Auf Wiedersehen Pet has come up this year, because we were talking about
it, Mike. It's amazing.
Talking about Jimmy Nail in the Morons from Outer Space episode.
Oh my God!
Unavoidable, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess BritBox and I have an appointment.
Yes, you do. So it's a short series. It was only 2 seasons back in the day when a season was like 6 or 8 episodes. But it is amazing. Everyone in it is amazing. Jimmy Nail was amazing in it.
Timothy Spall as well, wasn't it?
Timothy Spall in a really early role before he became sort of well known through the Mike Leigh stuff and that. The whole cast is incredible. But I went back to it last year and I thought this was just such quality writing and TV.
James Booth as Varel he is the antagonist, but we don't really realize that as we go on until we start to see those flashbacks, and which throws this more into a noir camp at times, and just the devastation of this movie as you go through it. But yeah, it is. It's weird. It's Czech. It's kitchen sink drama, to your point. It's a little film noirish. It's just, wow. Yeah. What a weird mix. But for me, it all fits together in a very interesting way. It doesn't feel like they're handing you anything. It feels like you have to do a little bit of work in this film to really get it. And I'm okay with that. It's just the very first time I saw it, I was like, what am I watching? This is so bizarre.
And I mean, the noir element is weird too, isn't it? Because you get that kind of central sequence where they're kind of driving around trying to replace the bottles, and it does feel very noir because you've got this jazz score. It's at night. You've got this kind of like city scenes, and yet, you know, I think that was one of my problems the first time I saw it, because like when you come down to what they're doing, in a way, it's kind of banal, isn't it? It's just, you know, they're kind of just like buying up these liquor bottles to replace them, and I think that was something that confused me, because it feels like there should be something kind of like more dramatic going on, really, and kind of like wrong foot you, I think. And I think I remember reading the review by, I think it was Bosley Crowther in the New York Times, and he was like, well, what? So what? It's just like a few like, you know, liquor bottles, and why all this kind of, you know, noirish, you know, tone. And it's kind of interesting because I guess a lot of the Czech New Wave was also about, you know, just trivialities, wasn't it? And just these little things that ultimately have like a wider impact. If you think of like something like Black Peter by Milos Forman, I mean, that's also set in a store, isn't it? And it's also about like kind of petty thieving and things like that. I guess some of that stuff is quite Czech, isn't it, really? That concentration on sort of minutiae. And I suppose also it's the fact that, I mean, the theft, of like the bigger theft, the theft of like, or the embezzlement of like the other supplies. I mean, we find out that, that actually would have been a lot of money. Kurka says that would have been like somebody's wages for like a year, basically, in Czechoslovakia. So I think that it's kind of like there's a contextual level there, isn't there, where I think that, it's actually, there's a sort of a bigger stake there than it may seem, really, because that's actually very expensive alcohol in this context.
Yeah, it's weird. They're not trying to hide a dead body. They're not trying to murder someone. They're not trying to steal $1 million. It is just this theft that has gone on for a long time, and that the two auditors, because we should also say that Sir Donald Wolfett is also here. So he's
also in Room at the Top as well. So that threw me. It does have another connection to that.
Yeah, he was a very familiar face when I saw him. I mean, those eyebrows just cannot be mistaken. He's almost Leonid Brezhnev-ish.
Yeah, I was going to say that. He kind of fits into the context, actually, doesn't he? I mean, I think if you didn't know who he was, he could plausibly be a Czech or East European actor, yeah.
He's great, though, even though he's not in it much, but he's really good at these kind of blustery type characters. And again, that's another very British thing, isn't it? So him with his little, all these little monologues that he's got, he's really good, even though you don't see much of him.
Spot check. We come to check your spots. You've been squeezing them again, I see.
And I love how he's the gregarious one and everybody seems to like him, even though he's there to do his job. But Kurka, man, he's just like, nope, I'm here. No, it's really bad for you to fraternize with the employees, and just is so businesslike, even though we've already seen him scoping out Alena. There's so much voyeurism in this film, and that we start at one of Czech's public pools, and with Hrusinky as Kurka looking at her specifically. And then we have that other guy. Again, you're talking about wrong footing.
Misdirection.
The other guy who's there at the pool, and you're like, oh, who's this guy? The guy who's like eating and looking at her. And it's kind of almost triangle of Hrusinky and this other dude looking at Anne Haywood. And I'm like, oh, okay. Is he going to come back? And no, he never comes back. Just the guy at the pool. I'm like, all right.
I got really confused at the beginning because for a minute I thought that Wolfett actually worked at the shop because he's got
he's got a rapport.
He's so friendly. It's like it's like, oh yeah, I get it. He's the manager. And Rudolph has come in to check. No, and then it was like, no, hang on a minute. He works for that was confusing. That was confusing because it was almost as if he'd always been there and he just worked with these people every day. And
I love when Hrusinky's like, everybody likes Bazant, but they don't like me.
It's weird going back to the scene at the pool with the young guy, because you get that later scene, don't you, where they're getting the new liquor bottles, and there's that group of men who start harassing her. And it's, I guess maybe that, the way they use that young guy at the beginning, it's just to sort of establish this very predatory environment, isn't it? But but the way it's set up like that at the beginning, it does lead you to think, well, something more is going to happen with this character, and then you never see him again. And I think it's more about like establishing a tone, I suppose, isn't it? And a kind of like a predatory, voyeuristic quality. But yes, it narratively doesn't really add anything, I think. One of the weird things as well is at least in one of the versions, you see Kurka drinking a beer when he's at the pool, and yet he tells you later that he doesn't drink. So I often kind of think about, what
he drinks at his home as well.
That's true,
I think, when he goes home, his son gives him a drink. So I think he just says that to be more official, like, I don't do that. Yeah, because he's got that really amazing sort of pernickety, which I love that type of personality in film, like official. He's just so pedantic and he's got no sense of humor, and it's perfect role for him because he's such a great physical performance. All his like little mannerisms, he's so uptight, and then she starts wiping him down, which is amazing. I love that. Now that wouldn't have happened in a British film, I don't think.
He's holding that candle, isn't it? It's very kind of phallic looking, kind of.
I think it's a very deliberate choice, too, of him wearing those glasses, and just it puts that layer between him and the rest of the world and makes him more of that observer character. He's just like, and it also makes his eyes look a lot bigger as well. So I really like just so much of what... It's so unfair to watch him being dubbed. So I almost wish there was a third version of this film where the English people spoke English, the Czech people spoke Czech, and that was okay. And you just, like, they understood each other completely. I'd rather just have them speaking their own languages and subtitle them vice versa and go for it, because Hrusinky, a lot of his performance is lost in the English translation.
Because that voice, I think, I think the English actor, whoever it is who's dubbing him, it's not bad, but it just doesn't have that kind of like resonance, does it? That kind of like purring quality that his voice has. Probably this is maybe kind of like a very British thing, but it, to me, just sounds too posh somehow, and it's like a little...
Yeah, it does sound posh.
I guess he is a kind of like he's a middle class character, but it's just a little bit over refined for me. Maybe that's just a very British, and the Menschik is a little bit more.
He was the one who threw me, because I got him as this sort of flamboyant, sexually ambiguous, like chattering Cockney. I was like, I can't deal
Cockney,
with this.
Yeah.
This is wrong. and this is just totally wrong to be coming out of his mouth. It was a strange choice. I
think I'd have given him a northern accent, but maybe that's because I'm northern. That's why. And Slovak too. Slovak has this, again, like sort of rather, maybe not as posh as the Hrusinky one, but again, it's this little finicky kind of voice, isn't it, really? Which again, I would give him a deeper voice somehow, I think. Yeah, it's just the associations kind of, are strange, aren't they, I think.
By the time I finish with you, I promise you your husband simply won't recognize
Emil.
you. You'll chuckle. Hello, sweetheart. Want a hairdo? Excuse me, my sister-in-law. I say, what about a massage over there behind the curtain? Of course, that goes without saying.
Emil, can you spare a minute, please?
Nice dress, really beautiful. I can't think why I married your sister when I could have married you. It takes money to just like you.
Emil, I haven't got time for this. I need help.
It made him almost like a comedy character when he's not actually a comedy character. He's just the brother-in-law, but it was almost as if they were trying to make him more of that. It's just that voice type he had has the connotations of that era of British comedy. And it's like, why? He's not really a comical character. Why have they done this? It was a strange choice, I thought. Strange choice, although you only get to see him in 2 scenes. But yeah, I couldn't really understand it.
It's also a very deliberate choice having Anne Haywood as our main female character, married to the producer. The producer was very much like, hey, I really want my wife in this. I want to make her a star. Apparently, Weiss was looking at, I'm trying to remember.
Betsy Blair, wasn't it, I think?
Betsy Blair, thank you, yeah. Who would have been 10 years older and I think would have played it a little bit differently. The whole tone of it would have been, this is a woman alone, a little bit more desperate. Varel would be a little bit more predatory, taking advantage of her, because he just takes advantage of her through the entire thing. And it feels like she's just had a whole series of bad romances, and this is the latest in a long string, and this is the worst of the lot. But I think having her as an older character, a little bit less sexualized perhaps, might have been a better choice. But Anne Haywood does a good job. It's just, it plays a little differently.
I always felt like Anne Haywood deserved more. She was a great actress, but she didn't really do an awful lot in film. And a couple of years on from this, she'd gone to Italy. By 1978, she turns up in Rings of Darkness, the banned pedo exorcist ripoff by Pierre Carpi, where she's with a 12-year-old full bush naked Lara Wendell having a bitch slapping fest. And it's like, what happened, Anne? What happened? She just had so much promise, but it was almost as if the film industry didn't quite know how to use her. Like, I love it when even in sort of the Italian stuff that she shows up in, I love it because I think she's great. She's always got a great sense of presence. it was almost as if they just didn't quite know, because she had a bit too much of intelligence to be the... And obviously 65, it was the year of Judy Christie and the Charlotte Rampling, so she didn't really fit into that either. I mean, obviously she's a name, but she never... I think she should have gone further. She is an incredible actress, and I don't know, it's interesting you said she should have been older, because I did read her as a kind of older character in this. And then I would get pulled back out when they'd make these comments about her being young and pretty, because she seemed to have the weight of the world on her shoulders. Like she'd been through it. So I don't know if that was just her choice to do it that way and the script was different. But there is a certain sense of like intelligent cynicism to her performance in this, which makes the ending kind of a shock, because you're like, hey, how did we get here? You've let me down, girl.
For the listeners at home, the whole story is, like I said, these two inspectors come to this store to take stock, see everything that's going on with this store. And so we have all of these liquor bottles that are going to flag something that's, a problem, this whole taking stock of things. So, what do you know? Varel, I think, has been selling things or taking things from the store. And so then they have to suddenly go out and replace this stuff. So he makes poor Alena go out and try to get money from everybody. She tries to go to Vladimir Menzik, her brother-in-law, try to get money from him, go to all these different places trying to get money so that they can buy liquor. So they go out, they buy this liquor. That's, like we said, the longer sequence in the film of them going to all these places trying to get replacement for it. And then what do you know? The liquor hasn't been replaced. There's a broken bottle and they find out that it's just tea inside of this liquor bottle. So it feels like Varel has played a fast one on her. Is that what I'm getting? Are you guys getting the same?
Yeah, I don't think she was in on it. She didn't know. He all the time. And then he's driving around in this bloody car. And the red flag for me was she's running around trying to borrow this money for bottles that he took. And then he's like, oh, here's my new car. And I just thought, you wanker.
So he's embezzling it. And
it's very Goodfellas to me. Merchandise comes in the front and it goes right out the back. And he's just making money. And so she's devastated. She tries to go to Kurka and tries to get him to listen to her. He won't listen because he's so officious. And she ends up committing suicide, but trying to commit suicide. And I like that line about, oh, well, her sister was late. Otherwise, she would have been rescued. And it's like, oh, so was this a cry for help or was this a real suicide attempt? And in the end, it ends up being a real suicide. Yeah.
It's a great performance, I think. You never really know what she's thinking.
Though we do get her flashbacks, so.
Yeah, we get her flashbacks, but what she often says to Varel doesn't explain her behaviour. She quite often fronts it out with him and says, I don't love you, I don't like you, I can't wait to get away from you. But then her actions suggest otherwise. Why is she running around town trying to get this money back? Why does she give a shit? Why not just say, wow, it's your bed, you lie in it? And so, yeah, she's a really ambiguous character, which I appreciated.
You take all of that and then you contrapose it against Kurka, and then you mention his wife, Kurkova, played by Ann Todd. He may be very put together when he's out in the world, but he comes home and she is just, I hate to throw this word around, she's a harpy. Oh my God. She is terrible. The one scene that's missing from the English version that's in the Czech version that I love is Kurka in his kitchen fixing himself some dinner, and you get to see how dirty the sink is. The sink is filthy, and it's just like she is doing nothing but laying in bed, drinking. He's got this layabout son who's just an embarrassment, doesn't want the son to be anything like him. Wow. Having that takes this movie from simple story to now it's elevated. And I love what they're doing with this relationship.
And it's really interesting, isn't it, for a few reasons, because, I mean, he's obsessed with order, isn't he? And then his home life represents the absolute opposite of that. And then also there's kind of like a weird parallel between these two sort of like dysfunctional relationships, isn't there? And in both cases revolve around bottles, because you have that like stash of like empty bottles that the wife is drinking, and then he's just putting them in the cupboard underneath the sink. And there's kind of like a weird mirror image of the sort of like the other situation there. And
I see him and Anne Hayward as parts of the same coin.
Well, they're both so lonely. Even though he's married, it feels like he is just completely on his own. She's got Varel, which is worse than having no one, but she doesn't know that. And yeah, they seem like these two very lonely figures who are never going to connect. And they should connect. You know, those two would be the perfect people together, but they're in their own hells.
They should have got together. There's a little bit at the beginning when they leave the shop and they're just saying goodbye. And he awkwardly asks her, are you going this way? And she says no. Where there's a little moment between them. Like just this little bit of chemistry. And you think, oh, is this where it's going to go? Is he going to fall in love with her? Is it going to, but there is real chemistry there between them. And then it's never like, then the next day they're back in the shop and it's business as usual. But it's a really beautiful scene because, like, to your point about loneliness, you can tell how lonely they both are. Just in this, it's like a little split second where they share this glance and he awkwardly says, oh, are you going this way? And she says, oh, no, I'm going that way. And he almost goes to follow her. And it's really sweet, I think. Only someone like Hrusinky could pull off that sort of pathetic but officious and scary but all the things going on, because he is actually deep down a very sweet character who has got horrendous home life and, all this kind of weird. I think he just wants to be good at his job, doesn't he? He just wants to be good at something because he's quite new. Whereas that other guy, the one who's been there years, his old Wolfit, he doesn't care. He's just like, yeah, whatever. Like, it's just forget it. Yeah, he doesn't want the paperwork, does he?
Even his boss, even Yuri Sovak is Redital. Yeah, he's just like, don't sweat it. It's okay. And then when he finds out the quote unquote truth about the suicide, he's just like, okay, yeah, we're gonna put this here and we're never gonna talk about it again. Thanks. Wow. Even though around this time it kind of becomes a little bit of a murder mystery right towards the end when Kurka's like, I know who really is to blame for this. It's Varel. And so he starts doing like the real creeping on him. And it's like,
I love that shot. That zoom is amazing, isn't it?
In the window, he's like, I'm onto you. I'm watching you. Oh, he's so good. I think his face is always in close-up, though, isn't it, in Czech film? And it's so perfect.
It's just that gaze, isn't it? That intense gaze. And it's just those movements of the eyes kind of up and down. And it's just so subtle. I really like, it was one of the things I picked up on, I think the more I watched it, that it kind of comes full circle, doesn't it, at the end, because it ends with him at the pool again, or at the, the sort of swimming area. And just as at the beginning, he's this kind of like embodiment of this kind of like impotent voyeurism. And at the end, it's kind of the same in a weird way, because he's watching Varel, but he can't do anything because he's got nothing to use to incriminate him. And he's just like watching passively and hopelessly. And it's just that sense of things just like kind of coming round full circle without changing. And it's still just this desperate situation at the end. You've still got that same kind of like just hopeless sort of environment again at the end. It's, bleak ending, really.
It is really bleak and sad. Go back to the kind of idea of masculinity, though. There is some really interesting, because you've got Varel when he goes to the house to sort of confront him, like, I know what you did. The way he picks that fucking kid up like a human shield and puts it right next to him and goes, well, you can say what you want now. Like it's like, oh my God, this guy is like the worst type of coward that, he's even using that kid to get off the hook. And there's like no flinch at all when he hears about this suicide. Like, he barely looks up, whereas Hrusinky's character is mortified when he finds out. And just the look, like all the colour and everything goes out of his face. But he's like the worst. I don't know if any of the men in this come out as quote unquote good, really, in a good light, because all of them, the bosses don't really care. You know, Varels is this horrible opportunist coward. He's probably a bit of a bully as well. When he slaps her, then you see his true colours. You know, even Hrusinky is like this weirdly impotent, lonely figure. He's probably the nicest, but then he's not that nice because he still puts her under all that pressure. So, yeah, and the son, that son is a little shit.
He's trying to help him with his math homework, isn't he? And he's just like...
He is the one who needed the slap. He was the one who needed that. It's a real, like, arm swing as well.
One of the other scenes that I think is only in the British version is the scene with that party. And I think that's...
Oh, my God.
That's so sort of sad, isn't it? The way, you know, Hrusinky turns up and it's just like that spectre at the feast, isn't it? And it's like everything just, like, stops. It's just, like, so, you know...
And her line going...
He spoils everything.
She just come home like, yeah.
Oh, man. And that the son is dancing with the mother. I was just like, that's kind of odd. There's so many birds in that room and he's just with the mother. I'm like, okay, great.
And that couple in the kitchen as well, about to have sex. It's like, this guy's just coming from work. What the hell is going on here? Just wants to make a cup of tea. That is a mad scene. Is a total mad scene, but he needed to give them all the slap. And I guess it just signifies how weak he really is, because he just does nothing. He just shuffles off pathetically to the next room. And then they all just carry on like, oh, he's gone now.
The music in this movie is so strange. That weird opening song where it's the spooky woman's voice kind of thing. And then it is like real hardcore jazz. Like Dave Brubeck just took a whole bunch of speed. He's just like, I'm ready to go. Let's do it. It's like, wow.
Yeah, the jazz is amazing because when they're doing the whole juggling the bottle, running around the off licenses thing, the soundtrack to it, I think like Jonathan said earlier, it's like makes it seem like some sort of, you know, thriller noir thing. But then when you look at what they're actually doing, it's like, hang on a minute, just going around the offies buying stuff. I was confused as to what they were doing for a few minutes because the soundtrack, I thought, oh my God, are they going to steal more? Like, what's going on? And then, hang on a minute, they're just buying this piece. Like, what is...
There's that scene with like this echoing piano thing that's going on. And then there's, on the soundtrack later, there's no music, but it's just that ticking clock and her memories with the ticking clock. I'm like, man, it's a very interesting way to present this stuff.
Which I think is stronger, isn't it, in the Czech version? I think they do more with the sound like that, where they kind of just like abstract the sound from like the sort of the other, you know, it's like you have that like one sound, like the clock ticking, and they take away the kind of other like ambient noises. And, well, I mean, one thing I think is really interesting is when you look at like Weiss's own comments, which I think is in the book, the Closely Watched Films book. I think it's the interview that he did. And the way he describes it, it's like so different from like the effect of watching the film, because he says something about, he saw it as like a political critique about the figure of Kurka, and that he's like this bureaucrat who is just like persecuting people. And it's about the nature of this system where you have these very officious people just hounding people to suicide. And yet when you watch it, I think that's not really the resonance that it has. It's more, I think it's more of, I mean, I would say if it's criticizing anything, it's more that just kind of casual corruption and the kind of slackness, which I think probably would have been more characteristic of Czechoslovakia at this time. That I think there probably would have been more people who were like Bajant or like the boss than like the Kurka figure. I mean, from what you hear about, you know, how Czechoslovak communism was like in especially the 60s, 70s, 80s, I think it was more that just kind of Jobsworth, not even Jobsworth, but just that casual, just like couldn't give a toss, attitude about, official business. And in a way, Kurka, in a weird way, he is the one who is kind of following the correct procedure. And I mean, he doesn't sort of intend, how things are going to happen, how things are going to, ensue from that. But I don't feel that he is kind of like the bad guy at all, really. I feel that he's not that he's a hero, but he's not a villain either, I think.
I really came to, I don't say all out like him, but there were parts of him that were quite sweet, especially seeing his home life and that. It's interesting you say that about that interview, actually, because I didn't read anything from the director, but I was like, where are the politics in this? Like, where are the politics? Because it's Czech. And it doesn't seem overly political. It doesn't seem overly political. It's more about the personal, just this petty man trying to keep control because of his personal life. And everybody else, like you said, Jonathan, this sort of low-level corruption, everybody turning a blind eye. It didn't feel like the big political statement that a lot of Czech films are from this period. Especially something like The Cremator, where you have got somebody who's very petty and, wants to climb the social ladder. And it's very different to the character he plays in The Cremator. And he's also pernickety and very detail-orientated in that. But this is a much softer, more sympathetic character, I think.
Yeah, there is an interesting trajectory, isn't there, of Hrusinky playing these sort of like eccentric, like official figures, isn't there, from this to like, because I think Murder Czech style, he's also some kind of petty sort of like office employee, isn't he, of some cases. It's another kind of
like bureaucratic. He's really funny as well. He was just so good at those roles, or roles with these like weird little characteristics to them, because he's just so physical. I just think he's perfect. But in a way, his acting style was so different to the British cast, because the British cast, very naturalistic sort of acting style, whereas old Rudolph is very into his little, cat. So he's like, I wouldn't say theatrical, because he is natural as well. But, there's that intense sort of quirks to his character that he's obviously spent a lot of time working in, whereas the British lot are just kind of slapping about, saying their lines, they're a bit more. So it's a really interesting mix of styles, and then with the music and everything on top as well. Does it entirely work though? I don't know. I think it does on a weird level. I know we've criticised parts of it, but yeah, I didn't find anything jarring, or, there are parts of it that seem kind of out of sync, but I think that made it interesting. I just think it made it interesting, but yeah, I think it works. What about you two?
I know what you mean. I think it is a little bit of an odd mix of elements that perhaps, where some maybe could have been emphasized more, maybe others like less so. And yeah, I would say it's like a minor gem, really. I wouldn't say it's like, we were looking at like Weiss's filmography, I would take like Romeo, Juliet and Darkness or Murder Czech style. I think for me, those are like the real masterpieces that he made. I think partly in this case, it was that odd mix of collaborators where you had, I think the producer, Raymond Strauss, he was going in one direction, probably Weiss was going in a different one. And, as you say, with the cast too, they're kind of like doing slightly different things, aren't they? And I believe there was a bit of tension, like on set, I think, between Hrusinky and the British actors. I know that.
I can imagine, because he seemed to have like a very formal style of acting, whereas, a lot of the, I know Anne Hayward did stuff on the stage, but a lot of the British sort of up-and-coming actors and they're totally coming from this kind of period in British theatre where everything had become about the method and about naturalism. So they're like much more low-key, whereas you can imagine that Hrusinky would be kind of, I wouldn't say difficult to work with, but you can imagine he'd be very into his performance in this formal way with everyone more relaxed.
From what I've heard from, I think it was on the commentary actually for the Blu-ray, and I think there's a quotation from Anne Todd's memoir, I think, where she apparently said that she just didn't have a happy time at all because she would And also because of the circumstances, because she was speaking in English and then Hrusinky would speak in Czech, or I guess in like phonetic English. And she said he would just kind of like stand opposite her with his head down, like his mouth would barely move. And, you know, she would have difficulty kind of like getting the cue from him. And I think she said like he had no sense of humor, which is kind of odd, isn't it, really, when you think of the kind of some of the roles that he played and just a general disconnection. And I think I've heard that Hrusinky was also a bit unhappy that like the British actors, they were getting paid a lot more.
Oh, yeah. Well, that would be a rub, wouldn't it?
And then not remember, you know, and then also just not being as together. Because I think he was like like you say, I mean, he was coming from that background where, you know, you had like real chops. And I mean, he was like on stage every night. So he was really like a honed, you know, very technically gifted actor who could just, you know, like the sort of like, it's the famous thing, isn't it? The Olivier thing, just like try acting, you know, you can just turn it on and off really. And like you say, the British style at that time was a much more kind of like naturalistic, kind of like spontaneous, you know, style. So yeah, I think you kind of get that too in the film, don't you? I think, because I think there's something about his presence that because of the sort of control that he brings to it, like the way he moves, where he turns his head, it's always very controlled, and he tends to kind of like overbalance, I think. And I know that some reviewers, I think at least in Czechoslovakia and I think elsewhere, they felt that like there should have been more about him really, and it should, like, he is the real center of attention, and it should have been like his story really.
Was him, isn't it? He upstages everyone. He always upstages everyone because he was just so incredible, but such a theatrical performer as well that he does stand out just on that. I was thinking totally different type of film, but the kind of arguments that they had between Peter Lorre and Boris Karloff on The Raven with Vincent Price in the middle, because Boris Karloff was like very formal. We read the script, we do the script, and Peter Lorre's coming in with all these like Brechtian techniques, and he won't read the script, and apparently Vincent Price is in the middle going, now come on. And they didn't get on at all because it's like, no, he keeps going off the script. And you could imagine someone like Rudolph being the same, maybe, especially with these sort of poorly trained British people. I'm not saying they were poorly trained. It was a different era, though. It was definitely that we're not going to do acting anymore era, wasn't it? And you suddenly had all those performers that came out of that, Hayward being one of them. James Booth was another.
So I think he was from that theatre workshop background, wasn't he? Like the Joe.
Yeah, like very kind of sort of, yeah. Or hey, chaps, we're just gonna, you know, it was all very not British. Just a tiny pocket of it, I think, that lasted about 15 years. But you can imagine the weird culture shock between them. Not like Italy either, where they were used to doing these co-productions. Because when you think of the British industry, it was so small at the time. I know like Ponti had his hand in it, and you had people like Marcello, we mentioned earlier, turning up in British film, in Diamonds Are...
Oh, that's a weird one, isn't it? Yeah.
Rita Tushingham is Tushingham as well. It's like, what the hell is happening here? But it wasn't that big. Whereas in Italy, they were used to having all these like diverse casts. But you think Britain was quite insular outside of letting Americans in, I guess. And the Czechoslovak industry was very insular just by virtue of the fact that they were under communism. So it's like the fact that this was even made is bizarre.
Weiss's career and just his life was so strange and fascinating. I listened to the Indicator disc, by the way, is freaking fantastic, of which I think, Jonathan, you had a hand in there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but the...
I think it always keeps quiet about that.
The interview with him on the disc, where he's talking about his experiences during World War II and just how he's jumping around from country to country to country and trying to get out of Czechoslovakia. He had made it to the UK. He went back to Czechoslovakia. He ends up trying to get out of there. He goes to Holland. He gets thrown in jail. It was wild. Like, his story was more unbelievable than the most unbelievable film. It was just wild to hear all of these stories of him doing this. And then, you know, that was just a section that he's talking about of like 6-7 years. And then after that, he again continues to bounce all around. He wasn't even talking about the stuff that happened after the Prague Spring and all this. And he's just, a man without a country for a lot of years.
Yeah, he's one of those figures who doesn't really fit into the kind of like period in Czechoslovak cinema, because he was maybe not even one generation, but I would say maybe even two generations older than like the new wave filmmakers. I mean, yeah, because he'd been making films during the war, or I think even maybe before as well. And I guess that was probably a problem with a film like this, where it doesn't quite fit into the new wave paradigm. And, he's just one of those figures who doesn't really have a place like in film history, really, because I think he probably made, I think I remember reading, he probably made one or two films early on that were kind of in that sort of socialist realist vein. But I think he was more or less able to sort of pursue his own path, like even in the 50s. And because I think even something like Romeo, Juliet and Darkness is actually a bit earlier, isn't it, than the new wave? I think it's like late, kind of around 1960. So, he was kind of like ahead of that whole thing, really, because he was doing, things like that before, the new wave really kicked off. And I think that's part of the problem, that he's just hard to categorize. He's hard to kind of fit into any particular period. And I think Murder Czech Style is probably his most new wave film in a way, isn't it? I would say. But even that is kind of not really that's its own thing. It's also like there's a bit of a kind of crazy comedy element in that as well, and it's
a bit like a riff on the whole, especially with the title, the Italian comedy styles as well. It's not, I love that film, but I was looking at his filmography before we did this, because I was like, how have that was the third film of his I'd seen. Obviously, Murder Czech Style I came to because of the Cremator, so I wanted to see more of old Rudolph. And Romeo and Juliet, I think I watched that before I did something with you, Mike, and I'm trying to think what it was, but it was something on World War II. But I was thinking, I've not really come across a lot of his work, even in the sort of grey areas of the internet where you look for that sort of stuff. He's difficult to define, not really part of the Czech New Wave, but even like you got people like Jiri Weiss and that who were outside of that, really, you can come across their work fairly easily. I'd not even encountered his work sort of in that, looking around, looking for new Czech films to watch. So it's interesting. And I guess for some people, they will only know him from 90 Degrees because it had a UK release, which is a shame. But I would like to see more of his stuff. I would like to see more of his films because he's interesting. Like Jonathan said, he's difficult to place. It's like he's just totally got his own thing going on, hasn't he? It's like, what is he doing here? And a lot of stuff from, like, with the noir or the Italian comedies, bringing in stuff from the outside that you generally don't see in Czech film from that period. So, yeah, I want to see more. Someone needs to do a box set of his work.
Well, and if people want to hear us talk about Murder Czech Style, the three of us will come back in a year and discuss that.
Yeah, we've already planned that, for God's sake. How sad is that?
Looking forward to that, though. Yeah, that'd be...
Oh, yeah, I'm looking forward. I haven't seen it for a few years. I'm really looking forward to going back to it. So I don't remember this one scene with old Rudolph Hrusinky with this, like, crash helmet on. He's, like, stalking. He's, like, running around. He's, like, really clumsy in it, and it's funny. But so different to this. So different to 90 Degrees. But he is a similar character in that, but it's a lot more fun, I think.
I remember there's another scene with him in that where he's kind of like just sitting in bed reading, and it's just about the sort of sad life of this guy who just has to, like spend his time in bed. He can only, he can read this bedtime book, and it's a bit like poor Kurka, isn't it? He's there with his wife. Different situation slightly, but again, that's, you're just consigned to just reading books in bed. That's all you can do.
I'm looking forward to seeing him actually speaking Czech in that film. So you're absolutely right. It is a purr. I mean, we especially get that in the Cremator. And so to see him in anything, he's always such a pleasure. I mean, the last time we talked about him was the Yuri Menzel film, Capricious Summer.
And he's so good in that. Again, another very theatrical type of character, isn't it? Because he's like he's chest puffing, but also weirdly, I remember us laughing at the wanking scene in that, the foot massage. How can someone say he had no sense of humour?
I think it was just maybe that just disconnect, wasn't it, of languages. And I mean, the weird thing is I think that, Weiss actually spoke English because, he would have done, I guess, with having been in the UK during the war. But I think they still had a kind of like an English language translator who would so I think Weiss would maybe talk in Czech to the Czech actors, and then he would say something in Czech, and then it would go through like an English interpreter. And I don't know how, it just sounds like it was a very cumbersome shoot. And like you say, Kat, I guess neither Czechoslovakia nor Britain had that kind of system in place where they were used to doing.
No, whereas Italy, every film was that. So they had like a whole sort of setup for it, didn't they? With production managers and dubbers and, all these different people whose whole jobs were there to accommodate the fact that most of the cast, every single one would be from a different nationality. You'd have like German, American, a Brit on there, and Italians, a couple of Spaniards. And so they had that industry there, but Czechoslovakia is such a closed industry. Britain, I wouldn't say, was very welcoming to was it really, to diversity. You had a lot of Americans, but that was about it.
Because even with all those like American productions, like in the 60s, they were usually like say, I was thinking of like say the Lindley Anderson films. Those are still like fundamentally very British films, aren't they? With entirely British casts. It's just that the money was coming from America, but otherwise there's no sign of any other kind of involvement by any other country. And there wasn't that kind of like just mixing of nationalities the way you see in Italian cinema. And I guess you had like actors in Italy who, even like Hollywood actors or British who were just used to doing co-productions. There were certain actors who just did a lot of those sort of films, and I guess they were used to doing it. And even people like Tranchignan, who did a lot of Italian movies, didn't he? And I guess just were familiar with how it worked. And I guess in this case, you had somebody like Donald Wolfett or Ann Todd, maybe.
I know, Donald Wolfett, man, in a Czech film. That's just wild.
It just made me think, actually, because you mentioned Vincent Price, and there is, I believe, hasn't there been a suggestion that he was the inspiration for the Edward Lionheart figure in Theatre of Blood, because he was that kind of Shakespeare. I don't think he was anywhere near as bad as that, but he was that kind of model of that kind of actor manager, sort of like Shakespearean, very sort of declamatory. And so you have that acting style, don't you, of him there against Hrusinky.
I guess he was like that, very formal, but in a different way. He comes from that era before the new wave in Britain, where they had this formality, but it was very posh, wasn't it? It was like very
like barnstorming, sort of.
Yeah, and he's kind of like from that generation. It's strange. And then you've got the two younger ones who are more natural, more sort of, old James Booth is just playing Kenny Ames, which is obviously derived from himself somehow, because he always seems to have that in his character somewhere.
The other weird element in this is the presence of David Mercer, who was like the writer I'm not entirely clear what he did on it, because Weiss seems to suggest that he didn't do a lot. He basically just polished it up, and then he added a few things. And then that's another really weird element, because like David Mercer was this kind of like strange experimental like TV playwright who wrote the movie Morgan, A Suitable Case for Treatment, that was based on his play, and then he wrote the script for that with Carol Rice, and it's got David Warner playing this kind of crazy artist who dresses up as a gorilla. And then he went on to write Providence for Alan Rene, and that's a really weird kind of other element in this, I think, because you have this British, I guess he was kind of a bit kitchen sink, but he also had this weird, like, surrealist or sort of like experimental tendency as well. And it would just be fascinating to know like what he brought to this, really.
Now you're saying this, because 65 in the British industry, there's kind of, it is the new wave, but you're getting a lot more experimentation going on. And by the end of the 60s, British films, you've even got surrealism in there openly in films like Wonderwall and whatever. And the Beatles films, and thinking about it, you know, the whole noirish elements of this and the very gritty sort of kitchen sink, bad relationship type thing. And I mentioned Room at the Top. That's like years before this. So it's almost like it's looking back to a style that it evolved by this point, even in British film.
Yeah, like you say, it's kind of at that transitional point, I think, isn't it? Because it's like, I think probably they made it.
Yeah, you had Billy Liar, which had aspects of fantasy. You had Darling with Julie Christie, which is quite a sort of weirdly cynical film that goes beyond that. And then it starts to go into some, like, a few years of, I'd say, kind of surrealist film. So that real sort of Room at the Top thing, which I think of like gold standard British New Wave, had passed. So it's strange now you were saying that, because it wasn't even really relevant to British film at that time. It evolved at that point. So it's like, what were they actually trying to capture? Actually, you know, they could have probably got away with more surrealism, because I think the audience here was open to that then. Or it was starting to shift towards that. So yeah, it's weird. Room at the Top, I'm trying to think, was that 59?
Yeah, I think it is, isn't it? Yeah, that's quite an early one.
It's like, yeah, it's almost like looking back, you've got this character who is like Lawrence Harvey in that, who's like a bit of a go-getter, he uses women and he's a liar, and you've got Simone Signoret, who, not to give any spoilers, but she's like this very cynical lover who's just had enough. And parts of that have elements of the noir as well. There's a scene in that where she's driving with this scarf on her head and they're up on this thing. So yeah, it's weird. I wonder what he was actually channeling here, because it was old school New Wave, not what was actually happening in the New Wave at that point, which was, the New Wave was probably dead by then. I would have said it was transitioning to something else, wasn't it?
That's right. Because I was thinking, you have those kind of like British kind of noirish films, don't you? Like, is it called Hell Drivers, the one with Stanley Baker, which I think is like about 1960, and
again they were a bit earlier. They were a bit earlier, weren't they? Yeah. So it's interesting.
Because I think this is like coming out in 65, which is, I guess, the like you said, the British cinema is changing, because you get those like the Richard Lester films, don't you? And
yeah, Richard Lester, the year after Alfie comes out. I mean, it's a real change in what was happening, and it was just when you were saying about, you know, the writing and that bit, and I thought, yeah, but this is old school. It's weird.
And then I guess the Czech New Wave, I guess by the time this came out, I mean, that would have started to really, I guess that would have been getting kind of international attention. So it probably just, I guess this is why it didn't really make much impact. And
these hip young cats, and you've got like...
Maybe if they'd made it about the son, I guess the son, Kurka's son, could have been a kind of like a Milos Forman character, couldn't he? I guess it could have been a different film. If they'd had more of the party, maybe it would have been more successful, I guess. But I think it wasn't even released in Britain, I believe. I don't think it even got which is really weird, isn't it? I mean, that's kind of...
So that is interesting. Yeah, I assumed it had come out here. But now it explains why I never, ever came across it, ever.
Yeah, what a weird thing to have this movie made for British audiences that never comes out there.
It does make sense, because British TV here in the 80s, with its like 4 channels, you basically got to see every British film ever made, because they would just recycle. That's why so many British horror fans are all like hammer, 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 because they just like, oh, this is British. You know, BBC Two, like, here's 4 British. It was like very much like that. And I thought, how have I missed this? Because literally everything else would just recycle on repeat, because, you know, and now it makes sense. If it never played it, never had a release here, it makes absolute sense why but yet we had, what's its name? The sci-fi Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Scold Myself with Tea. We had that on BBC Two. Not that I saw it at the time, but, you know, we talked about that before, didn't we? But not this, yeah. When I remember hearing about it, probably about maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, somebody telling me, and I was like, what? Rudolph Hrusinky was in a British film? What the fuck out? What? It just didn't make any sense to me.
I guess had it been a more successful film, he might have ended up doing like more international. But
then they might have taken him away, and then we would have lost all the wonderful. So Sorry, Rudolph. He didn't strike me as somebody who wanted to leave, though, did he? He was very much a national actor.
Well, yeah, I never realized until I was listening to that commentary that he was one of 4 Rudolph Hrusinkys, that his father was involved with acting, his son and his grandson were all involved with acting, and that he would go from stage to film. So he was working constantly.
Yeah, his film credits are like, how many film credits? He's got like 200 odd film credits alone, hasn't he?
He started in the 30s as well, like late 30s or early 40s. I mean, he was definitely around like in the kind of pre-war era. It's really weird when you see him younger. I think there's a movie called Barbara Hlavsova, which is a sort of film from the maybe early 40s by Martin Fritsch, and he's really young and good looking in that. And I remember posting a picture.
I can't imagine him young. So I've only. What year was Good Soldier Strike?
I think mid-50s. I think about 56.
I think that's 57. The earliest role of his I've seen, and he looks slightly younger, but not that young.
He's already sort of like cherubic looking, isn't he, in that? And but the son, one of the sons, is in Girl on a Broomstick. He is the young guy. There is a kind of a likeness, I think. But
oh no, I didn't know that. We even did an episode on that. I don't think we picked up on that, did we?
I can't remember which son it is, because I think that he had. I get mixed up, because there was at least one son, and then there's a grandson. I think there's 2. There's another son who is in the Snowdrop Festival. One of the sons is in the Menzel film, in My Pretty Little Village as well. I think maybe 1 or 2 of them are in there. I get mixed up, but
I didn't know that. I learn something new every day. Got enough trying to find all the dad's films, though, let alone another 2 generations of them.
Basically, the young, good-looking, like the teenager character in Girl on a Broomstick. I can't remember his name now. It's a while since I've seen it, but that's Hrusinky Jr. I can't remember.
Oh no, we didn't even. I don't think we noticed that when we did the podcast on it.
Is that the guy who's in his bedroom and with the cow and the birds and all that?
Yeah, is that the one?
Jan Hrusinky. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Oh, wow.
This won't mean much on the podcast, but this guy.
Yeah, no, I can tell. Wow. Now I want to know what he looks like now, whether he looks like his dad.
That seems to be a more recent one. Yeah, not really. There's another.
No, he doesn't really look like him.
There is a Rudolph Hrusinky. It directed a film called Pancha se Zenit. Looks like it's a Mexican-looking type film, but I don't know if that's the father or the Rudolph that we know, because they don't call Rudolph Hrusinky the second or junior, but I think his father was also a Rudolph Hrusinky.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the father,
and of course I'm not gonna base my stuff off of IMDb, so because that's a big mistake.
And then there's the grandson as well, who is in I've forgotten the name now of the horror. There's I think it's called Vampire Wedding. I think maybe basically it's this Czech vampire parody from the early 90s in which
I can't remember what it's called. I think it is something like the Vampire Wedding, isn't it?
I haven't even heard of that one.
Oh, you need to get it on Czechtember.
Okay.
Like, to get it on a Czechtember. Interesting film.
All right, let's go ahead. We're going to take a break and play a preview for next week's show.
For the last 16 years, Doreen Douglas has worked at Constant Consumer Magazine without a promotion. She was quiet.
Doris, sit.
Conservative.
It's Doreen.
And inconspicuous.
Excuse me.
Until the day.
Today's the big day.
They fired half the staff.
It's a massacre.
For this unassuming copy editor, keeping her job becomes an opportunity to do a little corporate downsizing of her own.
Doreen, you're done. Could you come hold the light?
For everyone that's ever punched a clock comes a dark comedy about what happens when the clock starts punching back. Carol Kane.
Look at this mess. I am going to have to clean it up.
Molly Ringwald.
I can hear someone breathing. Who is this?
Jean Triplehorn.
Let's go to lunch.
Office Killer.
Oh, you're a lifesaver.
Not at all.
That's right. We're starting off Shocktober 2023 with a look at Cindy Sherman's Office Killer. Until then, I want to thank this week's co-hosts, Kat and Jonathan. So, Jonathan, what's keeping you busy, sir?
Well, I'm teaching a course at the moment on East European cinema part-time for a university in Halifax, actually. So I'm really kind of, I'm really enjoying it, but yeah, it's a lot of work. It's a nice chance to revisit a lot of things, but yes, it's, I'm kind of a little bit on a kind of like a break from my other things at the moment, although I still do intend someday to kind of write more about David Mercer, actually the guy that I mentioned, and because I'm just obsessed with David Warner and guerrillas and Czechoslovakia and Marxism, and he was obsessed with all of those things too. So yeah, hopefully at some point in the near future, I'm going to get back to that. There's also the second run release of Dragon's Return, which is coming out on Blu-ray next month. I wrote the booklet for that a long time ago now, well, about 6 or 7 years ago now, I think. And that's basically the same booklet again, but you know.
It's a good essay though. It is a really good essay. I've got the original release. And I want to come on your course now.
You're welcome. Yeah, very welcome. You can teach it with me, though.
Jonathan, part-time teaching, I mean, you must just be sitting on a throne of gold right now.
It's a throne of something, yeah. It's interesting because I have a lot of material from before when I taught like a long time ago, and I'm just kind of like looking through my notes and I'm just shocked at like, you know, just the quality of what I wrote, you know, years ago. And so, yeah, I'm having to go back through some of the stuff that's less familiar to me. I mean, the Czech and Slovak stuff is okay, but yeah, I'm revisiting some of the Polish and Yugoslav and Soviet and, I mean, one interesting thing that kind of has struck me the more I've kind of like, you know, sort of like gone over some of this stuff is just how little known like some of the Yugoslav and the Soviet stuff is. I mean, I feel like almost like Czechoslovak cinema is the sort of like the dominant. I mean, that seems to be the one that's actually in a pretty good state in terms of like international recognition. And I mean, there's some really good like sort of Yugoslav new wave stuff that is really completely unknown now. And I feel that could be like a next thing to really promote and push, I think, and
I'm guilty of that, though. I am totally guilty of just gravitating around the Czech stuff.
I would love to talk more about Yugoslav film because I only know Makavejev. So if you could take me by the hand at some point and tell me other great things to look at.
I mean, I think the problem is just the fact that there's so little that's like really kind of properly available, like in good condition, really. I think that's where there needs to be. And I don't know whether there's, I kind of hear about, you know, like the different kind of like relationships people have with like film archives. And I mean, I don't really know how it works like in the kind of former Yugoslav, you know, sort of republics. But I mean, the thing with the Czech archive and the Slovak archive is like they're really, really good. They're really helpful. And I don't know, I don't want to kind of like badmouth any because I don't know how the situation is in say the, you know, other places, but it may also just be more complicated because you've got the kind of whole breakup of that little thing that happened in the 90s with Yugoslavia. So I don't know how it works, you know, in regards to like rights to things that were made in Yugoslavia and now maybe they're in archives in Serbia or Croatia. And
did they have their own version of Barrandov? Because Barrandov, and it seems like it was such a hub for everything. And without that, I don't think that we would be talking about Czech film so much.
Yeah, I guess they had regional studio. I mean, they had like, you know, Belgrade, Zagreb, you know, they had like multiple sort of like regional centers, I guess. So yes, it wasn't maybe quite as coherent as, you know, Czechoslovakia and, A lot of it is about that kind of access, really. And probably the same is true in sort of like some of the former Soviet republics.
I don't know. There's a lot of Soviet stuff on YouTube subbed.
That's true, actually. Yeah.
And the only reason I get into a little bit here and there, because obviously they do loads of the fancy fairy tale stuff. That, to me, though, the thing is that makes it intimidating is it's huge. Like it is massive, and if that is a rabbit hole that would take a decade to get through. So I'm always like a teetering at the brink, do I want to go down here? And then I'll find something amazing and I'll be like, oh my God, I've got to see all of this. And then I'll look at how much they produce and oh my God, which Czech it's kind of small. So you can get acquainted quite easily, can't you?
Because I must admit, like, even say some of the Polish stuff, I think there's a lot of baggage, like culturally, historically, which, I don't always have, and Hungary too, and Soviet republics as well. And sometimes that I can get intimidated by just that cultural, historical, social baggage. And, but that's good. That's a good, I should have mentioned that about, that's right. Like the Mosfilm YouTube channel is amazing, isn't it? They have all this stuff there in really, sort of recent restorations with subtitles. And because I found that I was looking, I saw a scene that somebody had posted on Twitter from War and Peace, the Bondarchuk one. And I just was curious about whether it was there. And I think that the Mosfilm channel has the whole thing there, all sort of 6 hours or whatever it is of that.
This is what we do in our spare time. Go over to the Mosfilm. Everyone else is like, what?
And Kat, how many adventures are you having these days, you cine-slut?
Oh my God, I'm having loads of adventures. So my first slate of as a producer of releases at Radiance Films have just been announced. So my very first project there is probably so me. I'll never be able to top it. Elio Petri's Working Class Go to Heaven. So I've produced that. I've got Alex Cox on there talking about Jean Maria Volonti. I've got this professor, Matthew Kowalski, talking about Petri and politics, and got interviews and stuff. And I just fucking love that film. So it's been 10 releases. Not all of them are mine, but that is one of mine. You can go over to the Radiant site and check them all out. They're on a special price till October the 5th if you pre-order. I did, what else? The Sunday Woman was one of mine, and also She Dies Tomorrow, which is a modern horror film. So it's all over the place in terms of what they're putting out, like very high concept, surreal horror film. Some would say elevated, but I can't stand that fucking word. And I also got to do a commentary on one of the releases I didn't produce for a really interesting film called A Woman Kills, which was a French film, 1968 French film. Couldn't be seen till the 2010s. Jean-Denis Bonan. It's got a legit cameo from John Rollin in it. Half of the cast and crew from Rape of the Vampire turn up. And I did a commentary with the incredible Virginie Salavi. I was mainly there as kind of moderator and hand holder because it was her first commentary and she wanted to do double. And so she was just completely blowing my mind with all this stuff about the French politics and what these dates meant. And it was really fun, but it is an incredible film. It is like, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like a kind of cross-dressing killer would be what it looked like on paper with John Rollin in it. And, but it's not that. It's like this really avant-garde, talking of free jazz. It's got this bizarre soundtrack. One of the weirdest soundscapes I've ever heard in my life. Very unsettling. Political manifesto. It makes Godard look like establishment at that point. This is like total. I'm so excited that it's coming out, and I haven't been able to see them yet, but apparently the release they've managed to get a hold of. Fran at Radiance has managed to get, I think, some of his other shorts for the release to put on because, he's a very underground, like, unknown filmmaker. Getting to do that, which I think that's going to be everybody's new favorite discovery when that comes out, because it is, talking of the Czech New Wave and that, it would have totally fit in that sort of era with those sort of films, but it's France, so it's so what the hell is this film? So I've been doing all of that, and still doing my commentaries, still doing my Patreon, still doing a bit of everything.
I really must get that Working Class Goes to Heaven set. That sounds great.
The restoration looks incredible. It's had new subtitles done. Oh, it's just so good.
I've never seen it, and I think you put it on your top 10. So I really
oh my God, you'll love it.
Because I love the other patches I've seen. I love them. So I'm really, and I love the title as well. It's just a great.
It's totally me. I realised for anyone who's seen it, you've got Jean-Marie Volonté as this factory worker called Lulu Massa. And it starts off, he's in the factory and he's a really good worker, and all his workmates hate him because he puts them to shame with piecework. And he loses his finger and he becomes the poster boy for the union and the activists. It's a very cynical film. But all the way through, Jean-Marie Volonté, again, another very physical performer, he's just screaming. He's screaming about exploitation. He's screaming about the workers. And I watched it so many times recently because we had new subs done, so I had to keep checking through them. And I was like, oh my God, I am Jean-Marie Volonté. I'm Lulu. Like screaming about the Tories, screaming about the monarchy. I thought, oh my God, this is me. This is what I look like to people.
Well, thank you so much, folks, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. If you want to hear more of me shooting off my mouth, check out some of the other shows I work on, like The Shabby Detective, Dreams for Sale, The Life and Times of Captain Barney Miller, Rankin' on Bass, Podcast of Power, Midnight Viewing. They are all available where finer podcasts can be found. Thanks especially to our Patreon community. If you want to join the community, visit patreon.com/projection booth. Every donation we get helps the projection booth take over the world.
1:30 ve stínu, dochází nám let. 1:30 ve stínu, já vezmu na to jet, že neseženu zmrzlinu, zrovna když mám chuť. 1:30 ve stínu, jak nám praví rtuť. Tak Máňo, prolukuj to trošku. Bože, to je hit. Ne! 32 ve stínu a možná ještě víc. 32 ve stínu, i lvům je dneska hit. Chtěl bych být květem leknínu, jo, to bych si kvet. 32 ve stínu, dochází nám let. Otevři tam dveře, prosím tě, nebo jo, oni tady žádný nejsou. Bez naději. A 33 ve stínu, praská teploměr. 33 ve stínu, ze střechy kapetén. Teď přilepil mi na vestu celé hejno much. Já vydám se snad na cestu za polární kruh. A to mám ještě zpívat navíc. To je prosím ve stínu. Jo, 35 ve stínu, to bude můj hrob. 35 ve stínu, proč nejsem aspoň sob? Já snažím se už hodinu sklepat teploměr. 35 ve stínu, kape na mě terá. Zmrzlina, Fata Morgana. Ne! 36 ve stínu a nikde ani mrak. 36 ve stínu mám stéru krásný prach. Já žiju v hejnu pingvínu, mám polu jenom kus. Je 36 ve stínu, ale minus a ne plus.
He spoils everything.